catering for more people. So in 33 years, population increased by 134%. Education expenditure only increased by 1.6 billion and representing 53.7%. But this is the interesting thing. Let's go to the next slide. Now, if you look at this slide, right? In 1960, our per capita income was 93. By 1970, it had increased to 224. By 1980, 871. And by 1981, 807. As we were increasing education expenditure, our per capita income was increasing. That was because we were investing in people. We were investing in education. We were investing in the right skills, right? But look at, from 1982, our per capita income also started reducing. In all the 80 countries that we surveyed, no country ever reduced education expenditure for more than 3-4 years maximum. We reduced in 30 years. 30 years. So you can now see why everybody is running abroad to school, right? So what we did is to compare Nigeria with other countries and see where we are. This is Chile, South America. If you look at the education expenditure, I don't know if it's that clear. Chile, in 44 years, we took from 1970 to 2014. Chile, in 44 years, have invested 120.5 billion in education. Nigeria has only invested 48 billion. Chile has a population of 17.8 million people, 10% of our population. And you can see, as they increase education expenditure, right, their per capita income, this is the per capita income. Chile has a better per capita income than us because they are arming people with the right what? The right education and the right skills. The next, that's the per capita income of Chile compared to Nigeria. The next is Brazil. Brazil, with a population of 206 million people, have invested $1.5 trillion in 44 years. Nigeria has only invested 48 billion. You can see the per capita income, the disparities in per capita income. The next one is Mexico. Mexico, with a population of 125 million people, as in 2014, we used 2014 because all data were updated to 2014. Mexico, by 2014, in 44 years, have spent or invested 882 billion on education, compared to Nigeria with 178 million people that have only invested 48 billion. And you can see the income disparity between Mexico and Nigeria. Canada, with a population of only 35 million people, have spent $1.6 trillion that they've invested on their people in 44 years, compared to Nigeria, 48. You can also see the income disparities between Canada and Nigeria. These are the developed world, right? From Canada upward, I'm going to be discussing the developed world. Now, this is the United States. Now, I know why you're shouting. See, this is the reason why everybody goes to the US. This is the reason why everybody wants to go to the US. In 2014 alone, the US invested 900 billion. 900 billion in education. You see why all the innovations are coming out from the US, right? They are investing in their people. And that was why in the previous slides, right? They said all African nations only accounted for 1% of all the patented products that came out from the US in year 2000. That's the US. In 44 years, the US has invested 17.16 trillion. We go to United Kingdom. I'm just going to breeze through this, right? United Kingdom have invested 2.7 trillion in 44 years. And that's their GDP per capita. Germany has invested $3.5 trillion on education investment in 44 years. And that's their GDP per capita. as the income disparity is shown compared to that of Nigeria. Australia has invested $950 billion in 44 years compared to Nigeria. But the interesting thing is that when we got to countries like Egypt, right? I want you to look at the graph. Now, you see that the blue line, right, was ahead in the 70s. There was a time we had South Africans, East Africans, West Africans, North Africans, even the Arab nations, right, come to study. This was the time when the government was investing in us. When the government gave us good education, pumped money in education. By 1981, right, Nigeria had reached $3 billion in education expenditure compared to Egypt that year at 717. We were ahead. But look at the graph. Egypt remained on course. They did not reduce it. And by 2014, Egypt had reached an all-time high of 12.97 billion compared to Nigeria at 4.6 billion that year. And then when you look at the next slide, you see that Egypt has overtaken us in per capita income. That is why we are now going to Egypt today to school. Now, but the interesting thing is, we now saw that Egypt's per capita income, the disparity was not that wide. So what were they doing wrong? We went into their budget and the country as a whole and the economy. And what we found out was interesting. Egypt is the 12th largest country in Africa. But 90% of Egyptian land is what? Desert. 90 million people only live on 10% of the land in the northeast, city of Alexandria, Cairo, Port Said, and the cities along the Nile. Egypt is an economically disadvantaged country compared to Nigeria. But what Egypt has done, they know that the knowledge-based economy, right, is the future. So they started pumping money into developing people, education. And it has paid off today. South Africa, or let me go back to Egypt. In 44 years, Egypt has spent 148 billion on education, compared to Nigeria, 48 billion. Then South Africa, in 44 years, has spent 354 billion on education, compared to Nigeria. But when we now went into the Asian countries, if you look at the blue mark, right, we were ahead of the Asian countries in the 70s. And that was because we were heavily investing in education. Countries like Thailand were behind us. But look at Thailand today. Thailand has reached 18 points. In 2014, right, they had upped their education expenditure and reached an all-time high of 18.69 billion, compared to Nigeria at 4.6 billion. And in 44 years, Thailand has spent 208 billion compared to Nigeria, 48 billion. And then, if you look at the income, it also shows. But if you look at the graph, right, in 1981, our per capita income was far way ahead of Thailand. But today they are ahead of us because they invest in their people. Indonesia, the same thing. Indonesia, in 1981, was investing less than us, and our per capita income was better. But today, in 2014, rather, Indonesia reached an all-time high of 26.25 billion in education expenditure, compared to Nigeria at 4.6. So, in the per capita income too, you can see. But when we also looked at Indonesia, the per capita income is not that wide. Imagine. And we went back into the budget and found out, if you look at Indonesia, right, they also abandoned education for a long time. It wasn't until 1998 before they started investing in human capital development. And it started paying off. So, Malaysia, the same thing. And then, we now looked at education expenditure over the last 44 years, compared to population and what we have invested. Brazil is 116% of our population, but we've only invested 3.2% of what they've invested. Chile is only 10% of our population, but we've only invested 40.5% of what they've invested in education. Mexico is only 70% of our population, and we've only invested 5.5% of what they've invested in education. Canada is only 20% of our population, and we've only invested 3.1% of what they've invested in education. Germany, United Kingdom is 36.3% of our population. We've only invested 1.78% of what they've invested in education. Germany, we've only invested 1.36% of what they've invested. Australia, we've only invested 5% of what they've invested in education. Egypt is 50.3% of our population. We've only invested 32.9% of what they've invested in education. Thailand is 38% of our population. We've only invested 22.3% of what they invested in education. Indonesia is 143% of our population. We've only invested 21.9% of what they've invested in education. Malaysia is only 16.8% of our population, and we've only invested 24.8% of what they've invested in education. Is education an expense or an investment? It's an investment, right? So are we treating it as an investment? Let us look at the next slide. Now, Nigeria, right? If you want to know whether something is an investment or an expense, right? An expense increase in proportion to whatever you are paying for. For instance, you're an employer, right? You have 10 employees. You treat them to lunch every day at 500 naira per plate. That means your daily expense on lunch is how much? 5,000 naira. The day your employees increase to 20, what happens? You know your daily expense is what? 10,000, right? Let us look at it. Now, Nigeria has increased by 135% from that 1981. Why 1981? 1981 was when we reached our peak in education investment. From 1981 to present date, we've increased by 135%. But our education investment has only increased by 53.6%. Brazil has only increased in population by 65%. But education investment has what? Increased by 41%. Chile has increased by 56%. And education investment has increased by 606%. But let us go, United States, 338%. United Kingdom, 470%. Germany, 461%. Australia, 650%. Now, this is the Egypt. Egypt has increased by 101.5%, but education expenditure has increased by what? 1,709%. The opposite of what happened between 1970 and 1981. Between 1970, Nigeria's education investment increased by over 1,500%. That was why we had Egyptians coming to Nigeria to school at that period. But right now, our education investment is increasing by 53%, and Egyptians' education investment is increasing by what? 1,709%. You see the opposite, right? Is now happening, and that's why we're going to their country. Thailand increased by 2,625%, but only increased with 40% in population. Indonesia increased with 68.5% in population and increased by 2,469%. Malaysia increased by 101% in population and increased by 1,373. Now, you see why things are happening in Asia, right? The Asian economies now know that the future belongs to what? Knowledge-based economy. These were things that they were not even practicing in the 60s and 70s. And we that were practicing them, we left them behind and decided to what? So, let's go on. So, what have we learned? Education in Nigeria versus the world. Let's look at it. What is the economic consequences of our negligence? 1.5 million people sit for JAMB every year. Only what? 600,000 get admitted. 40% of the population. We have a huge market of 900,000. 60% that must look for admission elsewhere. It is a catastrophe. Now, and as they look for this admission, mind you, It is the kids from the Green Springs, the Grange, the Avicennia, the American